Welcome back, deep divers. Ready to explore some really big ideas, like really big.
You know it. Always up for a good philosophical mind bender.
Today, we're going full philosopher mode as we dive into, drumroll please, macroevolution.
Yeah, none of that tiny population stuff this time. We're talking about the grand sweep of life's history. Deep time.
Yeah.
Major transformations.
I mean, it kind of makes you feel small, right? Thinking about how life has changed over millions, billions of years.
Totally. It's humbling, but also kind of exhilarating, don't you think, to try and grasp these massive patterns.
Definitely. And the cool thing is, we can think like philosophers alongside scientists in this field.
Absolutely. I mean, evolution is a process, but it also raises some seriously big questions about, well, everything. Like, what's the nature of change itself? Where do we fit into this vast story?
Those are the kinds of questions we're going to tackle today. And to make sure we're on solid philosophical ground, we've got an awesome guide.
Yeah, our main source for this deep dive is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on philosophy of macroevolution.
Think of it like we're having a conversation with some of the top thinkers in the field.
Exactly. And our mission, to put on our philosopher hats, is to extract the core philosophical ideas and debates within macroevolutionary theory.
We want to uncover those mind-blowing insights that might change how you think about, like, the whole history of life.
Okay, so first things first. How do we even make sense of this whole macro versus micro thing?
Yeah, where do we even begin to draw that philosophical line?
Well, microevolution, that's all about those changes within populations. Gene frequency shifting due to stuff like natural selection, drift, all that.
Yeah, the nitty-gritty details.
Right. But macroevolution zooms out to look at the bigger picture. The evolution of new species, new genera, new families, the whole shebang.
So, like, the origin of mammals would be macro, but changes in fur color within a wolf population, that's micro.
Exactly. But here's the thing. It's not always super clear-cut. A species is made up of populations, and some evolutionary processes might operate above that population level, but still within a single species.
Oh, interesting. So even that initial distinction gets kind of blurry.
Yep. And it's led to some serious philosophical head-scratching.
Okay, now one big idea that's been super influential, at least in the traditional view of evolution, is this notion of extrapolationism.
So what's that all about philosophically?
Yeah, break it down first.
Okay, so extrapolationism basically says that macroevolutionary patterns, those big sweeping changes, are just the result of microevolutionary processes happening over a super long time.
Like, if you just let those small changes accumulate over millions of years, you'll eventually get the big transitions we see in the fossil record.
Exactly. Macroevolution is nothing but extended microevolution, according to this view.
But hasn't this idea that macro is just micro writ large run into some issues? I mean, I remember Stephen Jay Gould having some strong opinions on this.
Oh yeah, Gould was definitely not on board with that. He actually coined that somewhat dismissive term, extrapolationism. His whole philosophical point was that new properties and processes can emerge at higher levels of biological organization that aren't just predictable from those lower levels.
Okay, so it's kind of like arguing against reductionism in biology. Can we really explain the whole history of life by just focusing on genes?
Exactly. Thinkers like Oppenheimer and Putnam, Fodor, Kitcher, Sarkar, and Rosenberg, they've all grappled with this problem of reductionism in science. Can we truly explain everything by breaking it down to its smallest parts? Gould and some other paleontologists argued, like, no way. The history of life shows us genuinely novel things happening at the macro level. It's not just the sum of all those tiny gene-level changes.
So if macroevolution isn't just micro on a larger scale, what's the alternative philosophical view? How are they connected, if at all?
Well, back in the 70s and 80s, there was what some have called the paleobiological revolution. Paleontologists were really pushing for their field to have its own distinct voice in evolutionary theory.
Yeah, they were arguing that fossils have their own stories to tell, right?
Right. And folks like Stephen Stanley were proposing that macroevolution could actually be uncoupled from microevolution in some ways. Basically, a certain macroevolutionary patterns need explanations that operate at the level of species and above.
So we need explanations that go beyond just population genetics.
Exactly. It's a philosophical shift toward recognizing the autonomy of the historical record itself. The fossils are telling us something unique about the history of life.
Were there any, like, specific models or examples that really drove this philosophical point home?
Yeah, definitely. There's this early model called the MBL model. It was developed by Gould, Rope, Sipkowski, Schopf, and Simberloff. It was super influential.
I'm sensing a pattern here. Gould seems to pop up everywhere in
He
macroevolution.
was a major player, no doubt. So this MBL model, it's a computer simulation, and it's designed to model large-scale evolutionary patterns. But here's the kicker. It ignored all those microevolutionary details, like natural selection acting on individual organisms,
Eh.
out the window.
Whoa, really? What was the point of that?
The philosophical point was to show that macro-level rules operating at the level of species origination and extinction could create significant evolutionary trends all on their own, like completely independent of those fine-grained details of population genetics.
Oh, that's a powerful statement.
It's like saying, look, macroevolution can have its own rules. It's not just a slave to the micro level.
So this idea eventually led to what's called the hierarchical expansion of evolutionary theory, right?
Yep. The idea is that evolutionary processes can happen at multiple levels of biological organization, from genes all the way up to clades. And these levels can interact in all sorts of complex ways.
Like a whole nested hierarchy of evolution.
That's it. And thinkers like Eldridge, Pivani, Sorelli, Temkin, Lieberman, they've all explored these hierarchical views and their philosophical implications.
Okay, so we've got this multi-level picture of evolution. Now, the Stanford entry dives into some specific macroevolutionary concepts. And the first one is, well, let's be honest, pretty famous. Punctuated equilibria.
Ah, yes, punctuated equilibria, or PE for short. It's one of those ideas that really captured the imagination, both within science and beyond. It has some serious philosophical punch.
Yeah, I mean, just the name itself sounds kind of dramatic, right? Punctuated, like something's being interrupted or disrupted.
Totally. And that's kind of the point. Eldridge and Gould, back in 1972, they challenged this long-held assumption that evolution always happens gradually and continuously.
So they were like, hold on, the fossil record doesn't really show that smooth, gradual change.
Exactly. They said, look, species actually tend to stay pretty much the same for long periods. We call that stasis. And then, bam, there are these bursts of rapid change, especially during speciation.
So evolution is more like a series of jumps and pauses.
That's the idea. And philosophically, it's a completely different way of thinking about time and change in evolution. Not smooth and gradual, but jerky and episodic.
Okay, that really does challenge the classic Darwinian view, right?
Big time. The dominant view, known as phyletic gradualism, Darwin himself was a proponent of this. Evolution is all about slow and steady change over vast stretches of time. And if paleontologists found gaps in the fossil record, well, that's just because the record is incomplete.
But Eldridge and Gould were like, no, maybe those gaps are real. Maybe stasis is the real story.
Right. They argue that the fossil record might actually be more accurate than we give it credit for. And those abrupt appearances of new forms, those are a genuine biological signal, not just missing links.
So from a philosophical perspective, this raises a crucial question, right?
Absolutely. It's an epistemological issue. Does the absence of evidence for gradual change in the fossil record actually mean gradual change didn't happen?
That's a tough one.
Philosophers of science like Sober and Curry and Turner, they spent a lot of time wrestling with these questions of how we draw inferences from the fossil record. It's not straightforward at all.
Okay, so punctuated equilibria with this idea of stasis was bound to cause some controversy, I imagine.
Oh, it did. Gould especially was really passionate about this idea. He saw it as this major challenge to the core assumptions of traditional evolutionary thinking.
And he went even further with it, right?
He did. He even flirted with this idea of hopeful monsters, which was proposed by Goldschmidt. This was this notion that every now and then you get these huge mutations, single-step changes that produce these totally new forms that are capable of starting whole new lineages.
That does sound pretty radical.
It was. And it really ruffled the feathers of people who really emphasized the power of gradual selection-driven change. People like Dawkins, Dennett, Stirling, they were like, no way, evolution is all about those tiny, gradual steps.
It's like two completely different philosophies of how evolution works.
Right. It was a big debate about the relative importance of different mechanisms and how to interpret those fossil patterns.
But despite the controversy, has there been evidence to support punctuated equilibria over the years?
Well, yeah, surprisingly. Despite the initial pushback, lots of empirical work has actually supported the idea that stasis is super common in the fossil record, and that morphological changes are often concentrated in these short bursts, especially around speciation events. Studies by J. Jackson and Cheatham, Hunt, Uyeda, and others have provided a lot of support for this pattern.
Okay, so the philosophical implications of punctuated equilibria are pretty significant then. It's not just some fringe idea.
Definitely not. It's changed how we think about the tempo and mode of evolutionary change.
You mentioned that Eldridge and Gould, when they first proposed punctuated equilibria, didn't really dive into the mechanisms behind stasis, right?
That's right. They hinted that species might have some sort of internal cohesion or maybe some homeostatic mechanisms that help them resist change, but they didn't give any concrete biological explanations.
That seems like a crucial piece of the puzzle philosophically. Like, why all this stasis? What's going on?
Exactly. It led to what's called the paradox of stasis. You've got this widespread pattern of morphological stability in the fossil record, yet there's all this evidence of genetic and phenotypic change happening in living populations.
So how do we reconcile those two things?
Well, there have been lots of explanations proposed. Stabilizing selection, for example, where selection just favors the existing form and weeds out variations,
Hmm.
or habitat tracking, where species move around geographically to stay in their preferred environment so they don't experience much selective pressure to change their morphology.
Okay, those make sense.
Yeah, but philosophers like Kaplan have raised some serious questions about whether those explanations are enough. And Sterlnians pointed out this challenge of coordinated stasis, where entire communities of species show long periods of stability.
So the whole question of stasis and what causes it is still a big philosophical mystery.
It is, and it's a really active area of research and debate.
Okay, moving on from the pace of evolution to the very units upon which evolution acts. Species selection, is that right?
Yes, species selection. This idea takes the analogy of natural selection to a whole new level, literally.
Okay, so instead of focusing on individuals and their traits, we're now looking at entire species, right?
Exactly. The basic idea is that different species, or lineages of species, have different rates of speciation and extinction.
Like, some lineages might give rise to new species more often than others.
Right, and some lineages might be more prone to going extinct. So species selection is like saying those differences in speciation and extinction rates are driven by species-level traits.
Wow, that's pretty abstract. Like, what kind of species-level traits are we even talking about?
Well, things like geographic range size are often cited as a species-level trait. A broadly distributed species might have a lower extinction risk, even if individuals within that species don't travel far,
Okay, that makes sense.
or the inherent rate of speciation of a lineage. Some lineages might just be more prone to splitting into new species, regardless of the environmental pressures on individual organisms.
So it's like selection is operating on these higher level properties of the species itself, not just on the individuals within the species.
Exactly. And this raises some pretty deep philosophical questions about what constitutes an evolutionary individual and what it means for selection to operate at different hierarchical levels.
Hold on, wasn't this species selection idea kind of controversial at first?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Initially, even Eldridge and Gould, the guys who came up with punctuated equilibria, they weren't fully on board with the whole species selection thing.
Really? Why not? They seem like the kind of thinkers who'd be into that sort of thing.
Well, in their early work, they were careful to say they weren't necessarily proposing a completely new type of selection.
So they were hesitant to say that species selection was something fundamentally different from traditional natural selection.
Yeah, it was actually Stephen Stanley who really coined the term species selection and ran with it. But even later, Eldridge and Gould, they tended to frame it more like natural selection, just operating at a higher level rather than a completely new process.
Okay, that makes sense. So, like, they were saying the same basic principles of variation, heritability, and differential survival apply, but at the level of species.
That's right. But even that raises some big philosophical questions like, can we really consider species to be individuals in a way that's similar to organisms? Philosophers like Giselin and Hull have argued for this view, saying that species are these cohesive units, much like individual organisms are.
So, if we accept that, then maybe species selection is just another form of individual selection, but on a much grander scale.
Right. But that leads to this ongoing debate about the relative significance of species selection compared to regular old organismal selection. Like, how much has each process shaped the history of life?
It's a philosophical quest to figure out the fundamental units of evolutionary change. Are we talking about genes,
Or,
organism, species?
exactly. It gets pretty mind-bending.
Yeah.
And philosopher John Beatty has really dug into these questions about the units of selection and the different levels at which selection can operate.
Okay, so if we entertain this idea that species can be selected, what kind of traits would actually give them an advantage in this species-level selection game?
Well, we already mentioned range size. That's a big one. Wider distribution generally means lower extinction risk. But Elizabeth Reba has also argued that speciation rate itself can be a species-level trait.
So some lineages are just better at making new species, and that can be an advantage in the long run.
Exactly. Reba has actually proposed some pretty specific criteria for defining species selection, emphasizing the need to show clear causal links between these species-level traits and how often they speciate or go extinct.
Okay, that makes sense. We need a way to make sure we're not just seeing patterns, but actually understanding the causal connections.
Right. It has to be rigorous.
Okay, let's talk about hierarchical theory. This seems to build on that idea of multi-level evolution, right?
It totally does.
Mhm.
Hierarchical theory takes this multi-level selection idea and really runs with it. It says, look, evolution can occur at all these different levels of biological organization. Genes, individuals, kin groups, populations, species, and even whole clades.
So it's like a big nested hierarchy with different levels of selection acting on different units of evolution.
Exactly. And the philosophical implication here is that evolutionary causation might not always be centered solely on the individual organism or the gene.
It could be distributed across all these different levels.
Yep. The rise of species selection, along with a renewed interest in kin and group selection, really opened the door for this more holistic hierarchical perspective on evolution.
So how does this hierarchical thinking help us understand something like stasis, which we talked about earlier?
Great question. We talked about stabilizing selection at the organismal level as one possible explanation for stasis. But Lee Van Valen, Sheldon, and others have suggested that during times of big environmental change, ecological generalists might have an advantage.
Okay, remind me, what's an ecological generalist again?
It's a species that can thrive in lots of different environmental conditions. They're not picky.
So they're more adaptable.
Exactly. And when things get rough, these generalists might be less likely to go extinct compared to specialists, those species that are super adapted to just one specific niche.
Makes sense.
So if you look at the fossil record and see lots of stasis, it might not just be because each individual species is experiencing stabilizing selection. It could also be because those generalist lineages are surviving and diversifying through a process of species selection.
Oh, I see. It's the same pattern of stasis, but the causal explanation is at a different level.
Precisely. That's the power of hierarchical thinking.
The Stanford entry also mentions genetic selectionism in this whole hierarchical context. Where does that fit in?
Genetic selectionism. This is the view famously championed by George C. Williams and Richard Dawkins. It's the idea that the gene is the primary unit of heredity and therefore the fundamental target of natural selection.
So, like, genes are the real players in the evolutionary game, and organisms are just vehicles for those genes.
That's the gist of it. And it sparked some pretty heated philosophical debates about agency in evolution. Like,
Yeah.
what does it even mean to say that something is being selected?
Right. What's the real unit of selection? And is it the gene, the organism, or something else entirely?
Exactly. Philosophers have come up with all sorts of terms to try and capture this, like replicator and interactor. Replicators are things that make copies of themselves, like genes. Interactors are things that interact with their environment and cause those replicators to be differentially successful.
So organisms are interactors.
Right. They're the ones out there in the world struggling to survive and reproduce. And those struggles ultimately determine which genes get passed on.
Okay, that makes sense. But I imagine this whole gene-centric view has its critics, right?
Oh yeah, plenty. A lot of biologists, including big names like Mayer, Gold, and Lewontin, they really push back against the idea that genes are the only things that matter in evolution. They argued that selection can operate at those higher levels too.
So it's not just a gene's eye view of evolution.
Exactly. And philosophers like Hull, Brandon, Lloyd, Griffiths and Gray, Sturl Grant, Godfrey Smith, they've all made important contributions to this really complex discussion.
Okay, so we've got all these different levels of selection potentially acting in evolution. Then there's this thing called the extended evolutionary synthesis, or EES for short. What's the philosophical gist of that?
The EES is this ongoing effort to, well, extend the traditional modern synthesis of evolutionary biology. It's like saying the modern synthesis, which combined Darwinian selection with Mendelian genetics, needs some serious updating.
So what's missing from the traditional view?
Well, proponents of the EES argue that factors that are usually seen as just constraints or products of evolution actually play a much more active and maybe even causal role.
Okay, what kind of factors are we talking about?
Things like developmental bias, how an organism's development influences the range of possible adult forms, or niche construction, how organisms actually change their environments and, in turn, alter the selection pressures they face.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just the environment shaping organisms, but organisms shaping their own environments.
Exactly. And then there's phenotypic plasticity,
Huh.
the ability of one genotype to produce different phenotypes depending on the environment, and non-genetic inheritance, like epigenetic changes that can be passed down.
So the ES is basically saying, hey, there's a lot more going on in evolution than just genes and selection.
Yep. And that raises all sorts of philosophical questions about the relative importance of these different mechanisms, the nature of inheritance itself, and even the very definition of evolution.
So the EES is still a pretty hot topic of debate within evolutionary biology.
Oh, yeah. And philosophers like Piglucci and Finkelman are really diving into these philosophical implications of this ongoing scientific discussion. It's a fascinating area where philosophy and science are very much intertwined.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about historical contingency.
Okay, contingency. This is a big one. And it gets at the very heart of whether the history of life was destined to unfold the way it did.
So, like, if we could rewind that tape of life, would everything play out the same way?
Exactly. Gould was famously a huge proponent of contingency. He argued that evolutionary history is deeply unpredictable. Like, if we ran that tape again, even with the same starting conditions, we'd likely end up with a totally different story.
So humans might not even exist in that alternate reality.
Maybe not. Maybe some other intelligent, tool-using species would have evolved instead. Or maybe intelligence wouldn't have arisen at all. It's a pretty humbling thought, right?
Totally. So contingency is this idea that chance events and unique historical circumstances play a massive role in shaping the course of evolution.
Exactly. And that has some profound philosophical implications. Think about it. If human existence is just a cosmic fluke, does that change how we view our place in the universe, our moral responsibilities?
Whoa, those are big questions.
They are. And philosophers are starting to really grapple with them. Like John Beatty has argued that this contingency of evolutionary history actually undermines the idea that there are any real biological laws in the same way we have laws in physics.
Oh, interesting. So biology is more historical and contingent, whereas physics is about universal laws.
That's Beatty's argument. And it sparked this whole philosophical debate about the nature of laws in biology. Other philosophers like Brandon Mitchell, Sober, Gier, Shapiro, they've all weighed in.
And contingency is relevant beyond just biology, right?
Absolutely. The idea that history is not predetermined has resonated with thinkers in other fields like history and social sciences. Philosophers like Klaas Krahenbrink are exploring the broader implications of contingency for understanding social change.
So it's a really powerful concept with wide-reaching implications. Okay, back to evolution specifically. How has this emphasis on contingency affected research in biology?
It's encouraged a much greater appreciation for the role of chance. Random events like mass extinctions, or even just those random mutations that happen at the genetic level.
Right, those random events can really shake things up.
Yeah.
And it's inspired research, too.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like there's this whole field of experimental evolution where scientists literally replay the tape of evolution in the lab, usually with microbes. They see how repeatable evolution is or isn't.
That's so cool.
It is. And Gould's work on the Burgess Shale, with all those weird and wonderful creatures from the Cambrian period, was a key piece of evidence for his contingency argument. He was like, look at all these bizarre body plans that just vanished. If things had gone slightly differently, the whole trajectory of life would have been completely different.
But hasn't there been some pushback against that interpretation of the Burgess Shale?
Yeah, there has. Some scientists, like Simon Conway Morris, they emphasize the role of convergent evolution, the idea that similar features evolve independently in different lineages, often because they're facing similar environmental pressures.
So, like, the eye has evolved independently multiple times in different animal groups.
Right, and Conway Morris argues that these instances of convergence suggest that evolution might be more predictable, or at least constrained, than Gould's strong contingency view implies.
Okay, so we have this tension between contingency, the idea that things could have been totally different, and convergence, which suggests there are certain predictable outcomes.
Exactly, and it's a really interesting philosophical debate. Some have even connected it to these deeper questions about teleology, whether there's some kind of direction or purpose in evolution.
Yeah, are we evolving towards some preordained goal? Or is it all just a series of contingent events?
Big questions.
Hmm.
And there's no easy answer. Even the idea of contingency itself can be interpreted in different ways.
Oh, how so?
Well, John Beatty of the philosophers argued that Gould actually used contingency in at least two different senses. One sense is about causal dependence, where the outcome of evolution depends heavily on the initial conditions and all those little events along the way.
So like a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon can cause a hurricane in Florida, that kind of thing.
Kind of. It's the idea that small changes can have huge ripple effects. The other sense of contingency, which Beatty now calls contingency per se, is more radical. It suggests that there might be some inherent randomness in the evolutionary process itself, like things aren't just determined by prior causes.
Whoa, that's deep.
Yeah, it gets pretty philosophical. And other philosophers, like Turner, have tried to reinterpret that second sense of contingency in a way that's still compatible with the deterministic view of the world. They say Gould's main point was about these macroevolutionary sorting processes that are essentially random with respect to certain outcomes, much like genetic drift works at the level of genes.
Okay, so it's like we're trying to make sense of what contingency really means and how it works in evolution.
Exactly. And then there are these other distinctions that philosophers have made, like source-independent versus source-dependent contingency, which McConwell and Curry have written about.
I'm starting to see why philosophy of biology is its own whole field of study. There's a lot of nuance and careful analysis involved.
Totally. You can't just take these terms at face value. You have to really dig into what they mean and how they're being used.
Okay, you mentioned the Burgess Shale again earlier. I remember Gould used it as this prime example of contingency, but our understanding of those fossils has changed, right?
Yeah, it has. When those fossils were first discovered, they seemed to represent all these completely new and bizarre animal phyla, and most of those phyla went extinct, which seemed to support Gould's idea that the early evolution of body plans was this kind of random lottery.
But then what happened?
Well, as scientists have developed more sophisticated ways of analyzing fossils and comparing them to living species, using both anatomy and molecular data, they've reclassified a lot of those weird wonders from the Burgess Shale.
So they don't represent totally new phyla anymore.
Many of them are now considered to be stem groups of existing phyla, basically early branches on the evolutionary tree of those phyla that we see today.
So they're still super weird and interesting, but they're not as radically different as we once thought.
Right. And that's led some people to say, hey, maybe this weakens Gould's contingency argument. Maybe the Cambrian wasn't this totally random explosion of bizarre forms, but more about exploring variations on some basic themes that already existed.
Oh, interesting. So as our scientific understanding changes, so do the philosophical interpretations.
Exactly. And this whole discussion has also sparked debates about what phyla even are. Are they these fundamental evolutionary units, or are they just another arbitrary rank in our classification system?
Another philosophical rabbit hole.
Right. It goes deep. And then there's this whole question of counterfactuals in evolution, which is directly related to contingency.
Counterfactuals. Those are those what-if scenarios, right?
Yep. Like, what if the asteroid hadn't hit Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs? What if those weird Burgess Shale creatures had survived?
Fun to think about, but how can we actually study that?
That's the challenge. But the debate about contingency versus convergence is really, at its core, a debate about counterfactuals.
Oh, how so?
Well, Gould's argument is essentially a counterfactual claim. He's saying if certain events in the early history of life had gone differently, we wouldn't be here today.
Makes sense.
But those who emphasize convergence are implicitly making a different counterfactual claim. They're saying, even if those early events had been different, something like human intelligence or complex societies might still have evolved.
So it's a clash of counterfactuals.
It is. And philosophers are now getting into the nitty-gritty of how we can even evaluate these counterfactual claims in evolutionary history. It's a tricky business.
It is, but I guess that's what makes it so fascinating.
Totally. It's a real mind bender.
The entry also mentions how our understanding of contingency might even have implications for, like, our values and ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that philosophers are just beginning to explore. Like,
Okay.
if human existence really is this cosmic accident, this improbable outcome, does that change how we view our place in the universe?
Does it affect our sense of purpose?
Maybe. And does it change how we think about our moral responsibilities to each other and to the planet? These are really deep questions that connect evolutionary thinking to our ethical frameworks.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to chew on. I'm starting to see how thinking like a philosopher can really change how we view evolution and maybe even our place in the world.
Me too. It's powerful stuff.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about another way of thinking about large-scale patterns.
hmm
Passive versus driven trends in evolution. What's that all about?
Okay, so paleontologists have noticed these directional trends in the fossil record, like Cope's rule, the tendency for body size to increase over time within certain
Oh,
lineages.
yeah, I've heard of that. Like horses started out small, and over millions of years, they evolved to be bigger.
Right. But Stephen Stanley pointed out that these trends we see in the fossils, they might not always be due to natural selection directly favoring that trait. Sometimes it might just be a statistical consequence of the way variation is distributed and the constraints that are in place.
So, like, if a lineage starts out small, there's more room for it to get bigger over time, just by chance.
Kind of. Imagine a lineage that starts out near the minimum possible size. Over long periods, even if evolutionary changes in size are random, the average size will statistically drift away from that lower boundary.
So it's like a random walk, but with a bias because of where the lineage started.
Exactly. And Stephen Jay Gould was really into this idea. He thought a lot of those large-scale trends we see, like Hope's rule, might actually be examples of these passive trends.
So just because we see a trend in the fossil record doesn't automatically mean that there's some strong selective force pushing it in that direction.
Right. It could be passive. And this realization leads to all sorts of philosophical questions about the role of chance in evolution.
Okay, and what are some of the broader philosophical implications of this whole passive versus driven distinction?